In this episode, I'm heading back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when I'd just moved out of home and the food writer Nigella Lawson began her seductive career as a TV chef with the series Nigella Bites, from which I immediately purchased the accompanying book. And it greatly inspired me to expand my usual cooking routine from freezer junk to new meals and ingredients I never would have tried before. It remains an incredibly well-used book with the splatters and annotations to prove it, most of which are from the first Nigella Bites series, as none of these recipes seem to have made it into this book, so I've had to hastily scribble them in. It seemed ridiculous to rid myself of this book just because I no longer eat meat, fish, dairy or eggs, so this is all about how I've adapted what I like from the recipes to what I like to eat now. So this week I am working with Nigella and Nigella Bites, and I have picked the recipes that I like, but I haven't necessarily copied them exactly as they are. I mean, I can't anyway because I'm making them plant-based, but in a couple of cases I have tweaked them to make them something that works better for me. So following the basic ideas from the Weeknight Survival Cookbook, which is my guide for these meal prep style weeks, each week has a staple. And that might be, in the case of that particular cookbook, a roast chicken week or a roast beef week or a roast turkey week or something like that. And then you take elements of that roast and you use them for the rest of the week. For me, this week, my staple is going to be the oh so humble soya chunk. Now, if you had asked me a year ago if I would be interested in trying these, I would have laughed derisively and kicked you out of the room. But it's 2022 and we're all looking for ways to save a bit of money, and these definitely do that. The difference with these and buying, say, some ready-made, ready-flavoured soya freezer chunks or some corn pieces or something like that is that you are going to get about a good 5 meals or so out of this. I mean, there is at least 4 to 5 cups worth of soya chunks in this packet. It's a 375 gram packet. The only place at the moment that I can buy this from is Holland & Barrett. They did used to sell it in Asda, but for some reason they've stopped doing that. I have no idea why. So get down to Holland & Barrett with your rewards card and pick up some soya chunks. And that should be enough, certainly for 2 people, to make this entire week. If you're more than 2 people, you may have to get a couple of bags, but it's still a lot more economical than buying separate soya chunks. As you can see, these things arrive as sort of strange little kind of spongy pieces. Well, they look like spongy pieces, but they're actually very solid. And one of these pieces, when it's rehydrated, it does tend to sort of expand a little bit. It doesn't expand a lot. It's not sort of lentil situation where you're going to get twice as much, unfortunately, but it does expand enough that you do feel like you're getting slightly more for your money when you use them. That's why I generally only need to use about 1 cup for the 2 of us, and I usually have plenty left over. In fact, if I'm making something like a stew, I could use 1 cup with lots of extra vegetables or beans, and that meal will easily last us 2 nights. So 1 cup is plenty for 2 people. However, if you don't like soya, or you don't fancy the idea of soya chunks, yes, you could use the frozen pieces, like the corn pieces or something like that. You could also use, for the bulk of the meals, you could use tofu. I know that's soya again, but if you just don't like the idea of the chunks, you could break the tofu up into little pieces and sort of fry it. I believe there's a Gaz Oakley recipe, which I'll try and find, and if I can, I'll link it below. You could also use a particular type of mushroom. I can't remember which one it is, but I'll look it up and put it here. And it can be pulled apart and it supposedly looks like and tastes like chicken. If you have the money, you could use jackfruit. That's an interesting alternative. And it would also possibly be useful for the fishless cakes. For the fishless cakes in general, if you don't want to use the soya chunks, which was a bit of an experiment on my part, you could use chickpeas. And you just mash the chickpeas. So I thought I'd start with a side-by-side comparison of the Nigella recipes that I've used to inspire my Kindly Eat makeovers. And most of the time it's a fairly like-for-like swap. with the changes just being for my own personal convenience, i.e. using spaghetti instead of linguine, but you could use either obviously when you were making this. The only big exception to this was the chicken and chorizo and cannellini beans, which I turned into a stew, and I explain in the actual cooking video why I did this. And this is the suggested week menu for these meals. Now you could actually do these in any order you like, and when I was making these videos I did them slightly out of order because I messed up on when I brought what. So this is entirely a suggestion, and you can just play with it based on what you feel like eating each day, particularly if you've meal prepped enough that you can just throw any one of these meals together when you're ready to do so. Now the shopping list might look a little bit daunting. This is only because I've tried to include everything I possibly can in this shopping list, and there are a lot of things that you probably will already have in your cupboard, so don't be too put off. I've left off salt and pepper for that very reason. I didn't even attempt to do a costing for all of this because the prices are changing on a regular basis, so it's almost ridiculous even trying. But I didn't find it a particularly expensive week, so hopefully if you've got plenty of options and supermarkets in your area, you won't find it too expensive either. The soya chunks themselves are very economical, and if you're a pro at these sorts of things, then yes, you could make your own sausages and your own bacon. You could definitely make your own breadcrumbs, so there are ways to reduce the costs of this particular shopping list. On to the fun part. Don't get me wrong, I know for a fact that meal prep is not the easiest of things to do, so if you would rather make the meals individually on the days, that would work perfectly fine too. But if you are going to do the meal prep, then this is what I recommend. Start by rehydrating the soya chunks that you're going to use throughout this week. Take out 3/4 of the soya chunks and add them to a separate bowl with chicken seasoning. The other quarter are going to be used as the sort of fake fish, so you're not going to be using those with chicken seasoning. And if you're following the menu as I've set it, then you're going to be taking 1/4 of those out to eat for tonight. Next, I'd recommend getting on with the slightly more labour-intensive meals, the risotto and the stew, which can then just be left to cool down in the fridge and possibly even popped in the freezer if you're not going to use them straight away. And I would also get on with the fish cakes at this stage, but not breadcrumbing them, where they can also sit in the freezer just ready to be pulled out whenever you want them. And finally, I would probably pre-grate the cabbage and the carrot purely because it'll make it a lot easier to just get on with things on the day, as that's probably, again, the most time-intensive part of that particular meal. And if you think you might want to try or use the cashew parmesan, then I would make this up as well today because it can just sit in a jar on the side until you're ready to use it. Now I know that just reading this out makes it sound like it's a really simple process, but I am aware of the fact that there's a good 2 to 3 hours worth of work involved in everything that I've just said. So you really need to make sure that you do have the time to put into this if you want to prep the meals. The payoff is that it will make it a lot easier to get on with your cooking on a work night, weeknight, particularly if all you have to do is pull something out of the freezer in the morning and leave it to defrost, or just pull it out of the fridge and freezer and cook it straight away. You may notice that I have made my menu Monday to Saturday. You could also make it as a Sunday to Friday. The reason that it doesn't go 6 days is because in the weeknight survival cookbook, on the 7th day, as they say, she rested, i.e. you could get yourself a takeaway or you could use up some leftovers from the rest of the week, whatever works for you. I really hope you enjoy this week's menu. I did enjoy eating them. I did make a few mistakes along the way, so I'm certainly hoping that you can learn from that and make yours a lot more perfect than I did. Unlike my previous Nigella Bites recipe makeovers, this one is disappointingly not in the accompanying book, but is instead from the first series, and I've hastily scribbled it into my copy of the book anyway. Nigella calls it,
of course, griddled chicken with Mothersbaugh yogurt and couscous.
And it is definitely a quick meal if you do use couscous. However, I'm making this in the colder months and fancy something a little bit more substantial, so my version is chicken-flavoured soya chunks with a herb-spiked plant-based yogurt and roasted vegetables. A bit more of a mouthful, but hopefully still a pleasant one. So first rehydrate a cup's worth of soya chunks in boiling water. That amount should easily feed about 2 people. Leave those on the side while you get the veg ready for roasting. I just used what we had: potatoes, carrots, onions, some leftover swede. Add some oil, salt and mixed herbs and stir it all in. The separate tray system is for the skin on a raw potato preference in our house, don't ask. Pop those in the oven for about 20 minutes at 180 degrees. And whilst they're in the oven, begin the yoghurt sauce by chopping up 2 cloves of garlic and 2 spring onions. Put them in a bowl and pour over about 200 mils or so, roughly just under a cup of plant-based yoghurt. Mix that together and chop up a handful of fresh coriander and about the same of fresh mint, and then gradually stir these into the yoghurt mix. It might take a while, but don't worry, you will get there in the end. And it does kind of smush down in the same way that spinach does when you cook it. I added chili flakes here for speed, but you could, like Nigella, use a real de-seeded chili, which would probably make it even tastier. Add salt and seasoning to your drained, now rehydrated soya chunks, plus a tablespoon or so of lemon juice and a teaspoon of oil. Olive oil is absolutely fine here. And at this point, your veg should have been roasting for about 20 minutes, so you can take it out, and if you want to, you can add half a tin or more if you prefer of chickpeas, and then put in your soya chunks as well. Stir up the vegetables to make sure they're not sticking too much to the bottom of the tin, and then give them about another 15 minutes or until your veg is roasted to your liking, and then serve the chunks and the veg on a plate and side with the yoghurt sauce. Delicious. So don't be fooled by the ridiculously long name to this meal. It was actually quite easy to put together. If, like us, you're having vegetables, then yes, there's a lot of chopping, plus the little bits of chopping for the sauce, but it was completely worth it. It was really tasty. I do recommend the yoghurt sauce. The only thing we found was that the coriander kind of overpowered everything on the first day, but strangely, when we used it up the second day, the mint was coming through a bit better. So it might be worth just checking that you have either an equal amount or maybe just a bit more mint if you prefer that flavour. I used soy chunks again because they were part of my meal prep week, but you could really use any sort of chicken flavoured or chicken style alternative that works for you. If you don't have chicken seasoning, you can kind of just mix together a few spices to get that sort of flavour going. So paprika, pepper, dried onion powder, parsley and sugar is what is actually in the chicken seasoning that I use. So maybe a mix of things like that, little pinches, and just play around with it until you get the flavour and taste that you like. So we really enjoyed this meal, and I will definitely make it again. I will probably try it again in summer and have a go at the couscous alternative because I suspect that's a lot quicker. But yes, it's well worth doing and very delicious. Chicken style soya chunks with a herby plant-based yoghurt and roasted vegetables. What? Chicken style, chicken flavour soy chunks. Chicken with soya flavoured chunks. Okay. Chicken with soya flavoured chunks, herb spiced plant-based yoghurt and roasted vegetables. Chicken flavoured soya chunks with a herb-based... Chicken flavoured soya chunks with herbs... Okay. Okay. Chicken flavoured soya chunks... Oh, I'm laughing. Chicken flavoured soya chunks with a herb spiced plant-based yoghurt and roasted vegetables. Ignoring my 20-something rice-hating self, I'm remaking completely plant-based Nigella Lawson's lemon risotto from the Nigella Bites cookbook and TV show. Finely chop 1 onion and 1 stick of celery. Melt about 1.5 tablespoons of vegan butter or spread with some oil, again about 1 tablespoon or 2, over kind of high heat initially, and then turn it down to medium heat once it has started sizzling. Now it's time to use my other half's old-fashioned scale set, for which I require a conversion chart, to try and work out how to weigh 300 grams of rice. Now, before anybody freaks out, yes, I am using basmati rice and not the correct arborio rice. Apologies, Italy and cooking purists. Fry the onion and the celery with a pinch of salt in the pan until the onion is softened. Boil a litre of water in the kettle and pour it over a stock cube or an equivalent amount of vegetable stock. Now add the rice to the softened onion and the celery and stir it into the sticky, buttery oiliness. I clearly need Nigella's book on adjectives. Pour in the stock a little bit at a time, allowing the rice to soak that bit up before putting the next bit in, until eventually covering the rice completely with all of the remaining stock. Don't worry, the rice will definitely soak up every single bit of stock that you put in there, even if it looks a bit strange initially. And then after about 20 minutes, it should be cooked enough. At this point, I added 2 tablespoons of lemon juice from a bottle, 1 teaspoon of dried rosemary, 2 tablespoons of nutritional yeast, 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, half a teaspoon of salt and a pinch of pepper. Stirred all of that in, plus half a teaspoon of turmeric, but if I did it again, I'd add a whole teaspoon, and 1/3 of a cup of plain unsweetened yogurt. In this case, soy yogurt. And it's ready to serve with a pinch more black pepper. Now, admittedly, my final product was more stodge than splodge, but does it live up to Nigella's review?
So you eat this, you know the world is a better place.
Well, yes, this is definitely comfort food, and my other half and I really enjoyed it. It tasted more cheesy than lemony, I have to admit, which is probably because I didn't use a real lemon or the zest, but I'm not actually sure if we would have necessarily enjoyed it if it was more lemony than cheesy, but who knows. It also, my other half said it looked a bit plain, and he would have preferred it if there had been a bit more colour to it. Now, interestingly, the celery was supposed to have been chopped really small, but I didn't. I just chopped it into sort of quarter circle shapes, and it had a nice extra crunch to it, and you couldn't taste it as celery, but it just made a sort of a nice extra texture, and it had a splash of colour, therefore, to the meal. So I would definitely do that again, and next time I would probably also have a second stick of celery chucked in for good measure. I did use basmati. It's not supposed to be used for risotto. I know that technically this is a lemon rice dish, not risotto, but I didn't have enough of the risotto rice in the cupboard. It's a bit expensive, and it's 2022. As we all know, this is not a great year for spending more money than you need to, so I stuck to basmati, and I've made risottos with basmati before, rice dishes with basmati before, and they've been fine. It probably did change the texture. It may be the reason why it was more stodgy. That could also, however, have been because I needed to add more water, admittedly, but who knows. In terms of the turmeric as well, I only added half a teaspoon because I was worried about too much of the turmeric taste coming through. But I would definitely add a whole teaspoon next time and not worry about that so much. But it's really just there for colour, so you don't have to add it at all. And the yoghurt, I used the plain soy yoghurt, but you could potentially use oat cream as well. She uses double cream. It's very difficult to get unsweetened vegan double cream, so just use whatever you have. Finally, she talks about this being enough to serve 2. I've got to say, I served half of this between the 2 of us. It was plenty for me. My other half had a little bit more, so we've got about 1/3 of it left. I reckon you could easily spread this between 3 to 4 people. Definitely. So yeah, unless you have an appetite like Nigella, this is a really good tea time meal for 3 to 4 people, and I would definitely make it again. You may be able to surmise from how clean this page is that I've never actually made this recipe before, so this is a bit of a learning curve for me as well. But it sounded interesting, and it used chicken, therefore I could replace that with soya chunks and see how it went. You start by pickling an onion, so take a medium-sized onion and cut it into thin slices, and then get all of the pickling ingredients together, which feels like a lot of stuff, but let's work through it and you'll see it's fairly simple. So to a bowl, add 1 tablespoon of sugar, and now I use a heaped teaspoonful of garlic powder and half a teaspoon of chili flakes. Then add 1½ teaspoons of lime juice and 1½ teaspoons of vegetable oil. I use sunflower oil. I then used 1½ teaspoons of apple cider vinegar because I didn't have rice vinegar, and 1½ teaspoons of soy sauce because I didn't want to use the original fish sauce in the recipe. Stir up and you're ready to add the onions to this mixture and start the pickling process. Make sure all the onions are fully coated in the sauce and then leave them on the side whilst you move on to the next step, which is to make the salad, or essentially a coleslaw. So I took 1 large carrot, peeled it and cut it in half, and then took about 1/3 of a head of cabbage, which I attempted to weigh to get 200 grams. This comes to about 198 grams, so it's probably about right, or at very least close enough. I then decided to cheat by using my food processor to grate the vegetables. Would have worked a lot better had I remembered to use the right blade first time around, but it did the job, shredded the vegetables, and now I can move on to the next step. Taking a bunch of mint leaves and cutting them down finely so that they can also be mixed in with these vegetables. Now on to the soya chunks, and I'm using rice noodles here because they are both plant-based and quick and easy to use. So I boiled the kettle with enough water to go over both the rice noodles and to rehydrate my soy chunks. It's not really a good idea to do them in a cup like this because they're better in a bowl, but I was trying to save on washing up. However, if you do them in a cup, just make sure that you check that all of them are getting rehydrated, including the top ones. And once they are rehydrated and drained, you can pop them into a wok with a bit of oil and add some chicken seasoning to start flavouring them up. And then it's time to plate up. So first put all your vegetables into a bowl with the herbs and the noodles. My other half also have mushrooms, we'll ignore that though. Add in the onions and the chicken pieces and then stir everything in together and you have an absolutely amazing and delicious meal. Every single mouthful of this meal is different. It really is worth making this. And yes, I added noodles into this to make it a little bit more substantial, particularly as we're eating it in the winter, but I think we will definitely make this again in the summer, even without the noodles, because it was so delicious. And just because I found it amusing, I've included the accidental vegan egg at the end. If I've made this recipe sound complicated in any way, then that was a huge mistake and I can only apologise. I really do recommend you trying this. I did mess up my tablespoons and teaspoons when I was doing the voiceover recording, which I apologise for. Do make sure that you check the actual recipe above so that you get that correct. But this really is not a complicated recipe. Yes, there's some stirring, yes, there's some shredding, and yes, there's some chopping, and a bit of chucking boiling water over things. But other than that, it is really very simple, and it is just too tasty for you not to try it. It makes enough for 2 to 4 people, and we had 2 large bowls, and there was plenty left over for another time, so I really do recommend this. This is my most repeated recipe from this book, probably because of its pure simplicity and tastiness. There are only 3 ingredients to the original recipe: linguine, garlic oil and pancetta. I do make my own little tweaks to this, even beyond the plant-based makeover, but it still takes no time at all to make. I, for instance, like to add an onion. But before we get to all that, let's discuss the strangely grey looking blob next to it. Or rather, let's talk about vegan bacon. There are a lot of vegan bacons or facons in the supermarkets you could use here, and all of them would work. Just cut them into strips or chunks and fry. If you're not a fan of fake meats, you could use firm tofu. Smoked tofu would work well, or a simple marinade of soy sauce, smoked paprika and maple syrup makes a good substitute. That same marinade could also be used on mushrooms or carrots or a whole array of vegetable subs. Take a look at Sauce Stash's experiments or do a quick online search and you'll be amazed at the number of facons there are. Inspired by Sauce Stash, I thought I'd have a go at making my own seitan bacon, and whilst I enjoy experimental cooking, my success rate with seitan meats is pretty low. So I'm not going to do a step-by-step here. If you want to make some facon, then I suggest you watch the original Sauce Stash video. But these are my ingredients, except for the miso. I got that out by mistake, so ignore that. I drained a tin of chickpeas, reserving the aquafaba because it will all get used in this. Then I measured out my Vital Wheat gluten flour. I chose to make the white, fatty, fake part first, as that would mean I wouldn't have to wash out the food processor in between the 2 doughs. I did add some onion powder for extra flavouring and some vegetable suet as an experiment on Sauce Stash's recipe here. Then I used almost exactly the same ingredients for the pink dough, except that I didn't have any liquid smoke, so I just subbed in some extra smoked paprika instead. I also added some nutritional yeast, which I don't think was in the original Sauce Stash recipe, but Sauce Stash had suggested adding it to seitan in a different video to improve the texture. My white dough was definitely softer and stodgier, but anyway, I left both of them to rest for a few hours and then attempted to layer them and rolled the slabs in cling film, put it in the freezer to firm up. Because I wasn't sure about my success, I pulled it out of the freezer an hour later and I fried a piece up. I couldn't get it very thin, even with extra rolling, so it was a bit chewy, but it tasted okay, and there was a definite difference in texture between the chewier pink part and the softer fattier part, which was interesting. I then chopped a chunk off for later use and returned the rest to the freezer, but the separate piece was stored in the fridge and it decided to turn grey, as dough tends to do, which was a little disappointing. But anyway, back to the actual recipe. I sliced 1 onion and then I chopped up my facon meat so they were both ready to be put in the oven. I did add some extra smoked paprika to the facon to just bring out the flavours a little bit more, and then because I didn't have any garlic oil, I put on some olive oil and I added some garlic powder. Crushed garlic would probably have tasted even better, but I was working with what I had to hand. I then stirred all that in together and popped it in the oven at about 180 degrees whilst I got the spaghetti ready. Now you can actually just fry your facon, and if you're using it, onion and anything else in a frying pan at the same time as doing the spaghetti rather than putting it in the oven, and I would quite often do that instead, but as I was following Nigella's recipe in this instance I did put it in the oven and just worked on the spaghetti. Whichever way you're doing it, at the end just stir your spaghetti in with your meat and anything else that you've cooked with it, like the onion, so that it soaks up a bit of the garlic oil, and then serve it up. We had ours with a couple of slices of vegan garlic bread, some cashew parmesan sprinkled over the top, and also used up some coriander and mint yogurt sauce from a previous meal, and it worked perfectly. Whenever I have vegan or plant-based bacon in the house, I always make this recipe because it is so easy, so simple, it's done in no time at all. Whether you add an onion or not, it's still really easy. And most importantly, it is really tasty. And that's what makes it the perfect evening meal. It's very difficult to get this wrong. I personally would prefer to make this just in a frying pan because it's a lot easier to do everything on the stovetop. Would I make the seitan facon again? Probably not, because I'm not very good at making seitan in general. It never seems to work for me. However, it is a really good way to save money because you're making quite a lot of it in one go, so I would recommend it from that point of view. Yes, it's true, my younger self was not a big fan of beans unless they were covered in tomato sauce. I'd like to say that I've grown out of that, but not really. Anyway, the making of this meal is actually very simple if you want to literally copy the exact recipe. You'll just need to buy some fake chicken breasts and some fake chorizo and a tin of cannellini beans, and then add in some kale and some smoked paprika, and that's pretty much all you need for this recipe. However, the problem is trying to get hold of those items. As you'll see, I've used Morrison's as an example here because that was the only place I could find everything, but it is extremely hard to find chicken breasts in most shops, and it's also very difficult to find the chorizo sausages in most shops. And even in this case, when I was looking through, although I could find the fake chicken breast, the sausages were out of stock. So my version is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to turn this into more of a stew using ingredients that I know I can get hold of very easily. So it's not quite the same recipe, but hopefully it will be just as tasty. I'm starting with the basic stew base recipe of celery, carrot, onion, and adding in a little bit of garlic. And I'm adding to that a quarter of a swede and half a courgette that I found in the fridge, because stews are a great place to use up any of your vegetables that you've got left over. So first thing to do is to chop all of that lot up. I then defrosted a couple of sausages from a packet of 6 that were left over, and I got about 3/4 of a cup of soya chunks ready to be rehydrated. Now I chopped the sausages into chunks, and I made a spice mix with a pinch of 5 spice, about half a teaspoon of chili powder and about a teaspoon of smoked paprika, heated up the oil in a pan, and then chucked the sausage and the spice mix in together. And once they were cooked, I tipped them out of the pan and put the veggies in, without cleaning the pan out, just to give them a little bit extra flavour. I then sweated down the vegetables, added the chicken pieces along with some chicken seasoning, and once the chicken pieces were also cooked through, I added the sausages, stirred everything through and gave it a little bit more of a cook before adding in a tin of baked beans. Yes, I cheated and used baked beans, but there you go. I then added in 1 stock cube and 2 lumps of frozen spinach instead of the kale, because that's what I had. And I then added a 1.5 cups of water and just left everything to simmer whilst the spinach was breaking down and defrosting. And then once that had done, it was time to dish up with a little splodge of plain yogurt and a sprinkling of paprika and some chopped up coriander that I had left in the fridge. What I loved about this meal was it was a great way to use the staple of the week and use up a load of vegetables from the fridge, but also the way it was cooked meant that although the sausage and the fake chicken didn't necessarily hold the flavours within themselves very strongly, it did go into the whole stew, which made it taste really nicely. It was sort of the 5 spice and the paprika and everything, so it actually was a really pleasant meal. Now obviously, yes, it would be a lot easier to make the Nigella version, but I didn't find this particularly onerous to do. It was just a case of chopping and then chucking things into a pan, leaving it to simmer and then serving it up. Using up the leftover yogurt was excellent for me, and then having just the extra coriander as well, again using things up. So this as a kind of end of week meal was quite perfect for just getting everything out of the fridge and having a nice tasty meal at the same time. time to remake a kinder plant-based version of Nigella Bites salmon fish cakes. But first I have to make the mash, so I chose 4 small to medium-sized potatoes to work with. Then it was time to weigh them out on our old-fashioned scale set, which involves lots of playing around with the different weights to work out which one's correct. I guessed around 300 grams, but will I be right? This is honestly like one of those computer games where you have to work out which of the weights is going to make it work, but without a useful hint button. And we have a winner. It's a 4.5, which is actually, as it turns out, probably a bit nearer to 350 grams, but that is about right for this recipe. So it's time to start peeling the potatoes, although stopping after a few seconds when the peeler takes half my nail off, and I wish I had Nigella's contraption.
The potato ricer. You don't have to peel the potatoes, you just stick them in and just force it through, and then you can just peel back the skin that stays there, so it makes life so much easier.
If only. Anyway, peeled potatoes and then chopped, and we're waiting for the water to boil, and while we are, we will use the secret ingredient for the salmon, which is soya chunks. It's just about a cupful of those. Pop them into a bowl, and now do not do what I'm about to do, which is adding the dill to them now. Wait until they're rehydrated to do this, because it's a total waste when you drain them from the water later. Water is just about coming to the boil for the potatoes, so I'm adding the salt now on Nigella's advice. If you add it beforehand, it will slow the boiling time down. Pop the potatoes into the pan, pop the lid on the top and leave them to cook. Again, ignore the fact that I am about to add a quarter of a nori sheet into the dried soya chunks. This can really wait until you have rehydrated them, so it's a complete waste of time. Your potatoes should be cooked when a fork can easily go through them. Do not do, yet again, what I did, which was to then leave them on the heat and let them go mushy. Take them straight off the heat, but do not drain them yet. Ladle some of that still hot water over your soy pieces, which will start the rehydration process. Back to my unfortunately overcooked potatoes. Do not do this, as you will see in a moment, it ruins everything. Instead, add about a tablespoon to a tablespoon and a half of plant-based milk, and about the same again of just any vegetable oil. You can use olive oil if you would prefer. Then I added about half a teaspoon of salt maybe, and some black pepper, and I also added some nutmeg according to Nigella's original recipe, but I'm not showing me doing this because I probably would have taken off another nail in the process if I did. And with all that in the pan, it's time to start mashing. The soy pieces should now be nicely puffed up and ready to be drained. Take them to the sink, do so, and at this point add the nori sheet and the dill. As you can see, I'm choosing to use scissors to cut the pieces down into small bits. This takes an exceptionally long time, so you may prefer to pulse them very slightly in a food processor or a blender. Just make sure that they're in smaller pieces than I've left them in, because otherwise they may taste a bit too chunky for salmon. Next, add a bit of lemon juice and maybe even a pinch of salt if you fancied it. Stir it all together, and you can even give it a taste at this point. These things are cooked enough for eating at this stage, but they'll be nicer later. Finally, add a bit of, the recipe says cayenne pepper. I only had paprika to hand, but as you can see, when you stir it all in, it does give it that salmony look, which is rather satisfying. Chuck in the mashed potato and start stirring it all together with a little bit of yoghurt, which isn't actually necessary, but I thought it might help with the binding process. Didn't need it with my slightly mushy mixture. As you can see, it wasn't easy to make my version into patties, but if you haven't overcooked the potatoes, it will be a lot easier, I promise you. I then put mine in the fridge for about 30 minutes, but obviously because they were so mushy they could have used longer. But in the meantime, you can start preparing the breadcrumb mixture to put on the top. Because mine are so soft, I decided that I would just use breadcrumbs rather than batter and breadcrumbs this time. Cover the potato cakes in breadcrumbs, pop them in a frying pan on a medium to high heat, and fry on both sides for about 5 minutes until done. Well, I managed to get 2 almost complete fish cakes sorted for my half, but that kind of soft potato is simply never going to hold together. I have made fish cakes just with potato and no egg in the past, and they do work, and I will show you how that can happen. Luckily, I had 2 left over, so I was able to put those in the freezer, and that's why I can show you what happens when you have some decent solid fish cakes to work with. To make the battered version, take about 2 tablespoons of flour. It's always going to be approximate depending on how many cakes you've got to batter, so you might want to consider about a spoonful per cake. And then slowly add in some water, stirring around until you get a kind of pancake thin consistency with your mix. Now add and stir in an optional pinch of salt. Get the breadcrumbs ready. Take your frozen fish cakes and dunk them first in the batter and then smother them in the breadcrumbs. This time you want to pop them in a frying pan and just get them slightly golden on both sides before popping them in the oven for 20 minutes at about 180 degrees centigrade, and then they can come out and they're ready to serve. So it might be a slightly slower process to cook them, but they do stay together much better. And serving them with tomato sauce, well, that was not my idea, that was actually Nigella Lawson's. Despite how they may have looked and the mistakes that I made in the first attempts, these were actually some very nice fish cakes. Let's just run through the obvious things that I would do differently next time. Tip number 1, don't overcook the mashed potato. Sounds very obvious, but you don't need egg in fish cakes because the mashed potato acts as a binder, so if you overcook it, it kind of ruins things. However, if you do accidentally overcook the mashed potato, like me, you can just make the patties up anyway. Make sure that they're smoothed out before you freeze them, and then take them out from the freezer to coat crumb and cook them, and they work perfectly fine that way. Tip number 3, again unlike me, is make sure that you add your fish flavourings to the soya pieces after they've rehydrated and you have drained them off. Otherwise you're likely to just lose all your herbs down the sink as you're draining them, which is a bit of a waste. And then tip number 4 is make sure you blitz your soya chunks if you're using them into smaller flakes, because if you don't, they can be a bit too big to be mistaken for fish. And one thing my other half said was that he felt that it was a bit more like eating sort of fish flavoured chicken rather than fish itself. So I would recommend blitzing them down if that's what you're going to use. I used them for this recipe because I wanted soya chunks to be the main ingredient for my meal prep week. But you could instead try using soya mince, which you can rehydrate, and that stuff probably has a much better sort of flakiness and fishiness to it. And these soy products don't really have any kind of flavouring by themselves, so they are perfect to use in all these kinds of dishes. But if you really didn't want to use soy, you could use mashed up chickpeas instead. And as you saw, I managed to get 6 fishless cakes out of this mixture. I probably could have made it 8 and they would have still been sufficient servings. I would definitely make these again, as they were tasty, they were fishy, which is exactly what you wanted. But I would probably next time try making them with soy mince instead and see if that flakiness worked better.